Okay, so good day everyone. Today we are to talk about the social, political, economic, and cultural issues in Philippine history. And as everybody knows, napakaraming mga pangyayari ang nakaapekto sa kung ano man ang kondisyon ng ating bansa ngayon. Kaya naman nararapat lamang na ating isa-isahin ang mga ito, just as what is stated on your screens, no? Pag-usapan natin ang social issues, political issues, economic and cultural issues in the Philippine history. Kasi ang mga ito ang siyang nagbigay daan, or these are the conditions kaya naman ang ating bansa ay nasa ganitong kalagayan ngayon, or the state of the Philippines is shaped by these issues of the past. And we are to first talk about the history of agrarian reform in the Philippines. Primarily, the Philippines is agricultural in nature. It is an agricultural country kung saan ang pangunahing kinabubuhay ng mga tao ay syempre agrikultura. And agriculture doesn't always mean na pagtatanim lamang ng bigas, ano? So, we have rice, we have corn, we have tobacco, we have sugar cane, we have coconut, and then sama mo na rin dyan yung uh, animal industry as well as the fishing industry. So that is part of Philippine agriculture, no? So ang laki talaga. But for this time, we are to talk about the agrarian reform in the Philippines. Okay? So we start with the pre-colonial times, or the Philippines before the 16th century. And the Philippines, even before being colonized by different countries, has already a developed and organized community, no? Ito yung sinasabi nating barangay, which came from the root word balangay, which means boat, no? And etong community na to is composed of 30 to 100 families na pinamumunuan ng isang chieftain or ng isang datu. So, bakit natin inumpisahan ang pag-aaral ng agrarian reform dito sa pre-colonial times? Okay. So here it is. So technically, sa isang barangay, syempre, if it is a community, merong tinatawag na land area kung saan sila nabubuhay or where they are situated upon. So, they own these areas, no? Itong land na to, mass of land. And land cultivation was done commonly by kaingin or the slash and burn method, wherein land was cleared by burning the bushes before planting the crops, or either land was plowed and harrowed before planting. Bakit? Food production was first intended for family consumption only, then afterwards, neighboring communities which were engaged in a barter trade exchanged their goods with others. And with this one, nag-thrive yung sistema, agricultural products exchanged with luxury items from some foreign traders like the Chinese, the Arabs, and some Europeans. Ayun, so in these barangays, everyone, regardless of the status, has an access of the land and mutually shares resources to the rest of the community. Ayan. So, in tribal areas, no, makikita mo doon yung concept pa rin ng land cultivation or the concept of stewardship na practice during the ancient times, kung saan each family or kadalasan sa mga pamilya ay may sariling sinasaka. Ayan. And during these times, meron din silang land transactions. And one of the famous, no, is yung selling of Panay Island to the 10 Bornean Datus in exchange for a golden salakot and a long gold necklace. Ito yung recorded transaction, no, through the Maragtas Code. Then, we also have here the Code of Luwaran, which is one of the oldest written laws of the Muslim society, which contains provision on the least cultivated lands. However, there was no record how the lease agreement was actually practiced. So, yan ang basics ng agrarian reform, no? Uh, each family or the families in the communities has the access to lands. Then here comes the colonizers, the Spanish, ushering the Philippines to the Spanish era from 1521 to 1896, more than 300 years of colonization in the Philippines, which affected agrarian reform greatly in the country. Ayan. So, in native rural communities, each Christianized native family is given out 4 to 5 hectares of land to cultivate. During this time, the Spaniards introduced pueblo as an agricultural system. This is sometime in 1521. However, these native families are merely landholders, but they are not the legitimate landowners. By law, the land was assigned to them, the land that was assigned to them was the property of the Spanish king, where they paid their colonial tributes to the Spanish authorities in the form of agricultural products or yung mga kinukuha nila or yung mga bunga ng mga pananim nila or ng mga tinanim nila sa lote or sa agricultural land na pinagtrabahuan nila. Now, in the 19th century, the agricultural exports were mandated and the encomienda system was developed as a new form of ownership. I know that you are very much familiar with the encomienda system because this was already discussed with you during your elementary days, during your high school days, and in some of your college subjects. Now, at the beginning of the 19th century, the Philippines as a colony of Spain implemented policies that would mainstream the country into the world of capitalism. That is why meron tayong agricultural exports during this time. Ang pangit nito, more people lost their lands and were forced to become tillers. So, naging trabahador na lang sila sa dating sinasaka nilang lupain. So, worst. Then we have here the laws of the Indies, which was implemented by the Spanish crown, which permits agricultural tenancy. This awarded vast tracts of land to the religious orders in the country, and some are awarded to the Spanish military as reward for their service, or ito yung tinatawag natin na repartamientos, kumbaga their price for achieving military prowess or military merits. And some are awarded to other Spaniards known as encomienderos to manage and have the right to receive tributes from the natives stealing the land, known as encomiendas. So because of this, the natives within these areas became mere tillers working for a share of crops, and technically, they don't have any rights to the land. Ideally, the purpose of the encomienda system is for the encomienderos to protect the natives and further introduce them into Catholic faith in exchange for tribute from the natives. However, meron tayong mga abusive encomienderos, almost. And this encomenderos collected more tributes that became the land rentals from the natives living in the area. So aside from these people tilling the land which they do not own for this time, they also pay tributes. They pay rentals. And there are some cases wherein pag hindi nila na-meet yung quota na sinabi ng encomiendero, they have to uh, use what's to be their share supposed in the future. So parang na-advance yung bayad nila. In short, mas naghirap sila. Then we have here a system practiced wherein tillers were made to compulsory sell at a very low price or surrender their agricultural harvest to the Spanish authorities, where encomenderos can resell it for a profit. And this is what we call compras y vandalas. People of the encomiendas during this time were also required to render personal service on public and religious work as a household helper to the encomienderos. Naging alalay, aside from pagiging magsasaka or aside from these people na magsaka sa lupang hindi sa kanila, they also render personal services to these encomienderos not only on public works but also for religious works. In 1865, there was a law made by the Spanish crown ordering landholders to register their land holdings, but only few were aware of this decree. So they were the only ones who were able to register their lands. Because of this, ancestral lands were claimed and registered in other people's names, specifically the Spanish officials, the inquilinos, the caciques or local chieftains, kasi sila lang yung nakakaalam ng ng batas na ito na dapat i-register yung kanilang mga lupain. As a result, many peasant families were driven out from the lands they are cultivating for centuries and were forced to become tillers. Ayun. That is the reason why, kung mapapansin nyo, even until now, nangyayari, no? Akala nila sa kanila yon, pero pag i-check nila, iba yung pangalan na naka-register kahit ilang taon silang nakatira doon. However, iba yung nakapangalan sa titulo. That is what also happened in 1865. In 1893, the ley hypothecaria or the mortgage law was introduced, which provided a systematic registration of titles and deeds as well as land ownership claims. This law was mainly a law on registration of properties rather than a mortgage law actually. So registration of properties parang yung sa nangyari sa 1865 din lang. In 1894, the last Spanish land law was promulgated in the Philippines, which is the Maura Law or the Royal Decree of 1894. This law states that farmers and landowners were given 1 year to register their agricultural lands to avoid declaration of it as a state property. However, with the encomienda system still being used, despite the different laws passed by the Spanish crown, more and more tillers were abused. They are even exploited, and some are even deprived of their personal rights and liberties. Kasi ang daming mapang-abusong Spanish encomenderos during this time. Now, dahil dito, isa sa mga rason kung bakit nagkaroon ng napakaraming pag-aalsa laban sa mga Espanyol is because the farmers and the peasants in 1896 articulated their aspirations for agrarian reform and for a just society. Even during this time that women also fought for freedom and played an important role in the planning and implementing the activities of the revolutionary movement. So technically, one of the driving force for the revolutionary movement during the last years of Spanish colonization in the Philippines, or even during the Spanish colonizations, mid-Spanish colonizations in the Philippines, was because of the unjust agrarian reform which was being implemented. The result of this revolution has made the government confiscate the large landed estates, especially the friar lands, and declare these lands as properties of the government. Ito yung nangyari in 1896. Kaya naman, during the Malolos Constitution, the drafting of the Malolos Constitution, itong mga large landed estates na pagmamayari ng mga encomenderos ay kinuha at nilagay bilang government property. That is under Article 17 of the Malolos Constitution in 1896. Now, after the Spanish ceded the Philippines to the United States uh, in the Treaty of Paris, another reform or agrarian reforms have also been made by the Americans. This is from 1898 to 1935. The Americans realized that the people or the Filipinos being landless during the Spanish colonization was the main cause of the main reason why there is social unrest and there are constant revolts during the Spanish colonization. Kaya naman, the Americans sought to put an end to the miserable conditions of the tenant tillers and small farmers by passing several land policies to widen the base of small land holdings and distribute land ownership among the greater number of Filipino tenants and farmers. Una dito is yung Philippine Bill of 1902, which provided regulations on the disposal of public lands, wherein a private individual can own up to 16 hectares of land, while corporate land holdings can avail of 1,024 hectares. However, this bill also gave rights to the Americans to own agricultural lands. It was during this time also that the torrent system of land registration was introduced. Etong torrent system until now ginagamit pa rin ng Philippine government, ano? So kung meron ng naka-experience sa inyo or may nakarinig sa inyo ng mga bumibili ng mga lupain, siguro naririnig nyo yung tinatawag nilang torrents title. Okay? So this is a system of land registration introduced during the American colonial period to replace the registration system that was implemented by the Spaniards, the mortgage law, and then the Maura law. The reason why they made a different system of registration was that uh, some of the 400,000 negative farmers were without titles at the start of the American era, and this situation was also aggravated by the absence of records of issued titles and accurate land surveys during the Spanish period. That is why the Land Registration Act of 1902 or Act number 496 was also enacted that placed all private and public lands under the Torrens system. This was then followed by the Cadastral Act of 1902 or Act number 2259, which sped up the issuance of Torrens titles and was done by surveying a municipality and presented the result to the Land Registration Court. Aside from this, Meron din tayong homestead program which was introduced in 1903 that allowed an enterprising tenant to acquire a farm of at least 16 hectares to cultivate. Sumunod dito ang First Public Land Act or Act number 926, which provided rules and regulations for selling and leasing portions of public domain, completing defective Spanish land titles, canceling and confirming Spanish concessions. Sumunod dito, the second ano, the second one, the Second Public Land Act of 1919 or Act number 2874, which limited the use of agricultural lands to Filipinos, Americans, and citizens of other countries, which this one supported the Philippine Bill of 1902, which gave rights to the Americans to own agricultural lands. On the other hand, Act number 141 amended Act number 2874. The revision consists of a temporary provision of equality on the rights of American and Filipino citizens and corporations. It also compiled all pre-existing laws relative to public lands into a single instrument. Another program or another law on agrarian reform being implemented during the American era was the Friar Land Act or Act number 1120, which provided the administrative and temporary leasing and selling of friar lands to its tillers. This was then followed by the Rice Tenancy Act of 1933 or Act number 4054, which is the first legislation during the American era regulating the relationship of landlord and tenants and the first law to legalize a 50-50 crop sharing arrangement. Aside from this one, this is for the crops, no? Or the rice one, meron din tayong Sugarcane Tenancy Contracts Act of 1993 or Act number 4114, which regulated the relationship of landlords and tenants in the sugarcane fields and required tenancy contracts on lands planted with sugarcane. However, despite the different land policies during the time, the farmer's situation does not or did not improve at all. In fact, it worsened the land ownership situation because there was no limit on the size of land holdings one could possess. Land holdings were once again concentrated in the hands of fewer individuals because these individuals can afford to buy and register as well as acquire fixed titles of their properties. Please do note kasi na during this time, hindi it's not majority of the Filipinos have no access to education. Hindi and a majority of the Filipinos have no access to such information such as the registration of lands and securing of land titles. Okay? So, therefore, more lands were placed under tenancy. As a result, there were widespread peasant uprisings headed by armed peasants or groups known as Colorum and Sakdalista of Luzon and Northern Mindanao, and these uprisings resulted to social disorder in 1920s and 1930s. Kaya naman, these militant peasants and workers organized and banded together to form a collective action against the abusive landlords and unjust land ownership situation, thus giving birth to the Communist Party of the Philippines. Then we have here the Commonwealth years. This was from 1935 to 1942. So technically, this is supposed to be the transition period of the Philippines for gaining independence, no? During these years, the situation of land ownership and tenancy were characterized by the contrasting economic and political lifestyle between tenant and the landlords. Why? The landlords became richer and powerful while the tenants were deprived of their rights, they became poorer and became absentee landowners. So dumami ang absentee landowners. Why? They preferred to go after new opportunities in the cities and left their farms idle to the management of katiwalas. That is why haciendas were poorly and unjustly managed. Kasi itong mga katiwala na to, they abuse the power being given to them by the owners or by the landlords. Okay? So a small plot of land cultivated by an average peasant farmer could not even sustain a decent living for his family. And dahil nga sa absentee ownership lang ang nangyayari, itong mga katiwala na to sa mga hacienda, ang lalaking fines, no? Very excessive fines, ang laking tax, and they even exploit these tenants, no? And what's saddening about this one was that some of these katiwalas are even Filipinos, so they exploited their fellow Filipinos. Systems for credit and marketing of rice were also lacking, thus farmers received a very low selling price. Kasi walang price cap. Basta kung ano ang i-determine ng buyer na amount, yun na. Diba? That is why peasant uprisings became widespread all over the country. By this time, President Quezon realized that land reform programs should be implemented immediately. However, this was short-lived when the Japanese have attacked the Philippines from 1942 to 1945. During the Japanese occupation, peasants and workers organized the Hukbalahap or Hukbong Bayan laban sa mga Hapon on March 29, 1942 as an anti-Japanese group. They took over vast tracts of land and gave the land to the people. For them, the war was a golden opportunity for people's initiative to push pro-poor programs, and landlords were overpowered by the peasants, but unfortunately, at the end of the war, through the help of the military police and civilian guards, landlords were able to retrieve their lands from the Hukbalahap. Okay? So, we have here the evolution of initiatives on land reform during the administration of President Quezon. This was still on the Commonwealth year. So, we have here Act number 4054 or the Rice Tenancy Law, which was the first law on crop sharing legalizing the 50-50 share between landlord and tenant with corresponding support to tenants protecting them against abuses of landlords. However, this law was hardly implemented because most of the municipal councils were composed of powerful hacienderos and big landlords. That is why they did not follow this law. The 1935 Constitution provided specific provisions on social justice and expropriation of landed estates for distribution to tenants as a resolution to the land ownership and tenancy problems. However, in fact, only one municipality passed a resolution for its enforcement, and majorities have petitioned its application to the Governor General. So all over the Philippines, only one municipality passed the resolution for the enforcement of the Rice Tenancy Law. The second one is the Commonwealth Act of number 461, which specified that dismissal of a tenant should first have the approval of the Tenancy Division of the Department of Justice. This is to protect the rights of the tenant. This is followed by Commonwealth Act number 608, which was enacted to establish security of tenure between landlord and tenant. It prohibited the common practice among landowners of ejecting tenants without clear legal grounds. President Quezon's program on land reform includes making a laid-down social justice program that focused on the purchase of large haciendas which were divided and sold to tenants. His administration was also responsible in establishing the National Rice and Corn Corporation or the NARIC and assigning public defenders to assist peasants in court battles for their rights to till the land. It was also during this period that the Court of Industrial Relations or the CIR was also set up to exercise jurisdiction over disagreements arising from agri-workers and landowner relationship. It was also during this time that the Rice Tenancy Act or RA number or Act number 4054 was amended. The Homestead Program continued through the creation of the National Land Settlement Administration or CA number 441, and tenancy problems were covered through CA numbers 461 and 468 or 608 rather. However, the implementation of these land reforms were hindered because of the budget allocation for the settlement program, and it made it impossible for the program to succeed. Also, sabi ko nga kanina, most landlords were members of the municipal council, and these landlords did not comply with the Rice Share Tenancy Act. That is why widespread peasant uprisings were still rampant against abusive landlords. In addition, there is the outbreak of World War II. Next, we have here the administration of Manuel Rojas from 1946 to 1948. First of his programs includes RA number 34, which was passed and was enacted to establish a 70-30 sharing agreement between tenant and landlord compared to that of the 50-50 earlier. And President Rojas also negotiated for the purchase of 8,000 hectares of lands in Batangas owned by the Ayala Zobel family to be sold to landless farmers. Okay. However, due to the lack of support facilities because this was the aftermath of World War II, the farmers were forced to resell their lands to the land-owning class. This failure gave basis to doubt the real meaning of land reform programs in the country because farmers during this time don't have the necessary equipment, no, to till the lands. And so, napilitan na silang ibenta ulit itong mga binigay sa kanilang lupain sa mga land-owning class. So next we have the administration of Pedio Quirino from 1948 to 1953. Same problem. Due to limited post-war resources, the program on agrarian reform was not successful during his time. However, the notable reform that he signed into law was Executive Order number 355, which established the Land Settlement Development Corporation or the LASEDECO to accelerate and expand the peasant resettlement program of the government. However, as what was stated earlier, because this is still post-war, or the Philippines is still under the aftershock of the World War II, the program was not successful. Then we have here the administration of Ramon Magsaysay from 1953 to 1957. When he was elected as president, he realized the importance of pursuing a more honest to goodness land reform, so he convinced the elite-controlled Congress to pass several legislations to improve the land reform situation in the country. This includes the following. RA number 1199, enacted in 1954, uh, the Agricultural Tenancy Act basically governed the relationship between landowners and tenant farmers. This law helped protect the tenure rights of tenant tillers and enforced fair tenancy practices. Aside from this, we also have RA number 1160, still enacted in 1954, wherein there is free distribution of resettlement and rehabilitation of agricultural lands, and an act establishing the National Resettlement and Rehabilitation Administration, or DINARA. In 1955, Republic Act number 1400, or the Land Reform Act, or known as the Land of the Landless Program, was enacted, which sought improvement in land tenure and guaranteed the expropriation of all tenanted uh, landed estates. The next one is RA number 1266, enacted in 1955, which concerns the expropriation of Hacienda del Rosario, situated at Valdefuente, Cabanatuan City, in the province of Nueva Ecija. During this time, Magsaysay also created the Agricultural Tenancy Commission to administer problems arising from tenancy. And through this commission, about 28,000 hectares were issued to settlers. It is also under during the presidency of Magsaysay that the Agricultural Credit and Cooperative Financing Administration was created. This is a government agency formed to provide warehouse facilities and assist farmers make their products, and establish the organization of the Farmers Cooperatives and Marketing Associations, or the FACOMA. However, with all the bills and programs passed under his administration, out of the targeted 300 haciendas for distribution, only 41 were redistribution after its 7 years of implementation. Why? This was due to the fact that there is a lack of fund and inadequate support services provided for these programs. That is why the landlords still continue to be uncooperative and critical to the program, and the problem on land ownership and tenancy still continued. Under Carlos Garcia's administration from 1957 to 1961, there was no legislation passed in terms of agrarian reform, but he continued to implement the land reform programs of uh, President Magsaysay, who died in a car crash. Then next we have President Jostado Makabagal from 1961 to 1965. His notable contribution is RA number 3844, or the Agricultural Land Reform Code, which is considered to be the most comprehensive piece of agrarian reform legislation ever enacted in the country during this time, enacted on August 8, 1963. Because of this, President Macapagal was considered as the father of agrarian reform. This code abolished shared tenancy in the Philippines. Kasi di ba dati-dati may 50-50, then may 70-30. Ngayon, this abolished now shared tenancy in the Philippines as it prescribed a program converting tenant farmers to lessees and eventually into owner cultivators. However, the landed Congress did not provide effort to come up with a separate bill to provide funding for its implementation. The act was piloted on the provinces of Pangasinan, Bulacan, Nueva Ecija, Pampanga, Tarlac, Occidental Mindoro, Camarines Sur, and Misamis Oriental. After Jostado Makabagal's leadership, we have Ferdinand Marcos from 1965 to 1986, more or less 20 years. And here are some of the notable legislations during his time. We have RA number 6389, or the Code of Agrarian Reforms, which governed the implementation of the agrarian reform in the Philippines and created the Department of Agrarian Reform, which is a separate administrative agency for agrarian reform, replacing the Land Authority. Next, we have RA number 6390, enacted to accelerate the implementation of the Agrarian Reform Program in the fields of land acquisition and agricultural credit. Through the code, an agrarian reform special account in the general fund was created that exclusively financed the agrarian reform program. Then we have here Presidential Decree number 2, which proclaimed the entire country as a land reform area. And followed by Presidential Decree number 27, which decreed the emancipation of tenants from the bondage of soil, transferring to them the ownership of the land they till and providing the needed instruments and mechanisms. This law also provided for tenanted lands devoted to rice and corn to pass ownership to the tenants, and it lowered the ceiling for land holdings to 7 hectares. This agrarian reform program was designed to uplift the farmers from poverty and ignorance and to make them useful, dignified, responsible, and progressive partners in the form of credit support, infrastructure, farm extension, legal assistance, electrification, and development of rural areas. This makes them useful, dignified, responsible, and progressive partners in nation buildings because of these services. The Agrarian Reform Program was also labeled as revolutionary by some sectors because it was pursued under martial law and intended to make quick changes without going through legislature or technical processes. And another reason is that it was the only law in the Philippines ever done in handwriting. I repeat, the president the Agrarian Reform Program is the only law in the Philippines ever done in handwriting during the time of then President Marcos. However, as was always stated during the past administrations, the program also posed some limitations, which includes limited scope of the program, since it was only directed for the tenanted, privately owned rice and corn lands, and still there was monopoly of businessmen in both coconut and sugar industries. Also, foreign and local firms were allowed to use large tracts of lands for their businesses. And during the last years of President Marcos' administration, he declared martial law, and this time several farmer leaders were arrested without the due process of law, as was claimed. After the 1986 revolution, the People Power One, or EDSA, as we popularly call it nowadays, Corazon Aquino succeeded presidency from 1986 to 1992. During this time, uh, the 1987 Philippine Constitution was enacted, which set the direction of agrarian reform in the Aquino administration. And the 1987 Constitution affirmed under Article 2, Section 21, that the state shall promote comprehensive rural development and agrarian reform. And here are some of the examples of the agrarian reform programs under the Aquino administration, the mother, Corazon Aquino. Proclamation 131, which was instituted as a major program of the government, this created the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, or the CARP, which which is the redistribution of public and private agricultural lands to farmers and farm workers who are landless irrespective of tenurial arrangement. The CARP's vision is to have an equitable land ownership with empowered agrarian reform beneficiaries who can effectively manage their economic and social development to have a better quality of life. The legal basis for CARP is RA number 6657, otherwise known as the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law, or CARL, signed by Corazon Aquino on June 10, 1988, which aims to promote social justice and industrialization, providing the mechanism for its implementation and for other purposes. Next, we have Executive Order 129, which reorganized the Department of Agrarian Reform, or DAR, and expanded its power and operation. We also have here Executive Order 228, which declared full ownership of the land to qualified farmer beneficiaries covered by Presidential Decree 27. It regulated the value of the remaining rice and corn lands for coverage provided for the manner of payment by the farmer beneficiaries and the mode of comprehension to the land owners. We also have here Executive Order 229, which provided administrative processes for land registration, or Lista Saka program, the acquisition of private land, and compensation procedures for landowners. It specified the structure and functions of units that will coordinate and supervise the implementation of the program as well. Then we have here what was stated earlier, the CARL, or RA 6657, which is the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law, which is the legal basis of the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program. However, before that, we also have here some of the accomplishments achieved during the Aquino administration with regards to the implementation of the agrarian reform programs are the grants and budgetary support from official development assistance circles poured in during this administration, which includes various sectors which recognizes agrarian reform as a worthwhile social investment. It was also during this administration that the present adjudication system was introduced, which gave DAR the original and exclusive jurisdiction over agrarian disputes as quasi-judicial powers. However, even if the administration received much support and active involvement in program implementation, the administration also faced challenges in the implementation of the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program. For example, land evaluation. One very specific case is the Garci-Torena land scam. There was also issues on the absence of a clear-cut guideline that would answer problems on land use conversion, and minimal efforts were exerted to discourage and or prevent conversion of lands into other use. Despite the Agrarian Reforms Fund, the administration also experienced a major budgetary shortfall. Okay, and they also experienced constant changes in DAR leadership. That is why this led to the lack of continuity of priority programs and projects. There are also allegations on the lack of political will and leadership and genuine commitment to implement the program. Ayun. So, sumunod kay Aquino is President Fidel V. Ramos from 1992 to 1998. And here are some notable legislations during his time. DAR AO number 2 or Department of Agrarian Reform Administrative Order number 2 enacted in 1992, which consists of rules and procedures governing the distribution of cancelled or expired pasture lease agreements and timber license agreements under Executive Order 407. We also have here DAR AO number 1, which includes amendments to certain provisions of Administrative Order number 9, series of 1990, entitled Revised Rules and Regulations Governing the Acquisition of Agricultural Lands, subject of voluntary offer to sell and compulsory acquisition pursuant to RA 6657 or the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law. Joint DAR and Land Bank of the Philippines Administrative Order number 3, which are the policy and guidelines and procedures governing the acquisition and distribution of agricultural lands affected by the Mount Pinatubo eruptions, followed by DAR AO number 1 in 1995, which consists of rules and procedures governing the acquisition and distribution of all agricultural lands subject of sequestration, acquisition by the PCGG or Presidential Commission on Good Governance, and APT whose ownership is under court litigation. And marami pa. DAR AO number 2, DAR AO number 2 also in 1996, number 2 in 1997, and Administrative Order number 8 in 1998. So, ayan. And lastly, AO number 5 in 1993, which refers to the implementing guidelines on the distribution and tilling of the public agricultural land. So, napakarami pa. However, despite all of this, there are challenges that the administrative face during the implementation of the program. Isa na rito is the failure in enforcing the installation of some farmer beneficiaries on awarded lands. Critics also say that non-physical of FBs has been the norm rather than the exception. And napakaraming sector ang nagreklamo because of the slowness of the administration in the acquisition and distribution of privately owned lands. Although this administration was credited for having the biggest accomplishment in terms of uh, land acquisition and distribution, critics say this is because the land acquired and distributed were more on public lands and rice and corn lands and not on private lands na na-accumulate ng malalaking landowners. And it was also during this time or even during the time of Aquino na isa sa mga problema is yung sa Hacienda Luisita, no? So, I would like everyone to please review some of the historical events or the events that happened which involved Hacienda Luisita of the Cojuangcos and the Aquinos in Tarlac. Then we have here Joseph Estrada's administration from 1998 to 2001 kasi nagkaroon ng EDSA 2. During this administration, the magsasaka or the magkabalikat para sa kaunlarang agraryo was launched, which directed for the investors to bring in capital, technology, and management support, while farmers will contribute at most the use of their land itself. This program or the Magsasaka program forged alliances among countries implementing agrarian reform through the International Conference on Agrarian Reform and Rural Development. Itong magsasaka na to na program, this aims to encourage investors to bring investments into the countryside as well as to enhance the income of the farmers through joint venture schemes and contract growing schemes. This also aims to enable the farmers to be more efficient and be globally competitive. However, there are many hindrances, no? Even if there are forged alliances among countries implementing agrarian reform, as well as the convergence initiative between the agrarian reform, Department of Agriculture, and DANR, there are many hindrances that the administration faced, like the fiscal constraints encountered that resulted to unpaid or delayed payments of landowners covered the compulsory acquisition and VOS schemes. There were also issues on inter and intra-ARB's conflicts due to arguments of control over negotiations with prospective joint ventures, and some of which became violent. And of course, the last blow for this administration was the impeachment trial of then President Joseph Estrada. Okay? For President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo's administration from 2001 to 2010, and we have here the concept of Bayan Anihan as the implementing framework for the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program under GMA's administration. Bayan means people, and people means a united people working together for the successful implementation of agrarian reform. And the Bayan Anihan framework has different implanting strategies, namely Salin Lupa, or accelerating land transfer and improving land tenure, Katarungan, which is the prompt and fair settlement of agrarian disputes and delivery of agrarian reform justice, Bayanihan, or the better delivery by the government of appropriate support services to ARBs and the mobilization of the ARBs themselves in the transformation of the agrarian reform communities into an agrarian reform zone and into progressive farming. We also have here Katarungan or the Konsehong Bayan para sa Anihan, which is the institutionalization not only of the system of dialogue and consultation, but also joint problem solving with agrarian reform stakeholders, particularly people's organization, cooperatives, and NGOs. Lastly, meron tayong kamalayan or raising the awareness of the Department of Agriculture, of Agrarian Reform personnel, agrarian reform beneficiaries, and the general public on agrarian reform and its contribution to social justice and development. It was also during the Arroyo administration that the CAR zone was introduced, or the Kapit Bisig sa Kahirapan Agrarian Reform Zones. This is a program strategy of the DAR and in CARP implementation. This is a partnership and convergence strategy aimed at achieving asset reform, poverty reduction, food sufficiency, fair, fair productivity, good governance, social equity, and empowerment of agrarian reform beneficiaries. So, other specific programs under the administration of GMA is the Gulayan ng Magsasakang Agraryo, which intends to add income and food security to farmers' children and dependents through the Jostado Makabagal Scholar Program. And dito na-adapt ni DepEd yung sinasabi natin na gulayan sa paaralan. And this administration is also accredited in heightening agrarian case resolution by introducing a quota system to compel adjudicators to work faster on agrarian cases and train farmers into paralegals. However, together or kapareha din ng mga naunang administrasyon, medyo madami-dami ding kinaharap na problema ang administrasyong Arroyo with regards to agrarian reform program due to the lack of how do you call this one? The lack of the implementation guidelines, no, as well as napakarami pa ring hindi naniniwala sa mga comprehensive agrarian reform programs dahil sa mga naunang mga pangyayari. And of course, we have here Benigno Aquino III's administration from 2010 to 2016. The Aquino administration focused on three major components: land tenure improvement, program beneficiaries development, and agrarian justice delivery pursuant to RA 9700. So, to substantially complete asset reform as mandated by RA 9700, ang daming mga nagawa. This is, for example, completing the land acquisition and distribution, or the LAD, in the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program extension with reforms, or CARPER. Ito yung RA number 977. The fast tracking of documents and settlement of landowner compensations for already distributed lands, adopting a job sharing scheme wherein the one DAR concept, provinces will share responsibilities to minimize the need to hire new personnel, and then partnership with the civil society organizations in the delivery of LTI services, particularly, or the land tenure improvement services, particularly the large size private agricultural lands, or PAL. Under Aquino's administration, the DARS program beneficiaries development, or the PBD, prioritized the following: undertaking convergence initiatives with rural development agencies to complement the resources and streamline the efforts of DAR, DA, and DENR, expanding official development assistance portfolio, and shifting focus of low LADs to balance provinces. and unlocking credit facilities for the agrarian reform beneficiaries through capacity development for credit providers and farm borrowers. Together with the efforts to fight graft and corruption by the president, it is imperative to have institutional reforms within DAR as a complement to the above mentioned DAR components, as well as give credence, transparency, and accountability at all sectors of the DAR bureaucracy. And we have here, of course, President Rodrigo Roa Duterte. However, medyo wala tayong nakikita in terms of agrarian reform programs because for now, nakafocus tayo sa paglaban sa pandemic. So, kailangang harapin yan. Also, for the Aquino administration pala, in addition, no, it is still hunted with the issue on Hacienda Luisita kasi isa yon sa mga lugar kung saan nagkaroon ng mga bloody na pag-aalsa just by the peasants. So it is a very very big issue which is hunting the Cojuangcos or the Aquinos or the administration of both the mother and son, Corazon and Benigno Aquino III. So yun ang pinoproblema nila. Ngayon, ngayon nalaman natin ang history ng agrarian reform in the Philippines, makikita natin na there is too much exploitation na nangyari just because of ignorance to the law as well as misinformation. Kaya naman, ang daming mga pag-aalsa na nangyari and even until now, ang daming mga kontra for new agrarian reform programs because they almost do not believe anymore with such kinds of programs if it still really could be implemented for the betterment of the society or para naman ba ito sa mga mayayaman. So yun yung mga issues na kinakaharap ng Pilipinas on agriculture or the agrarian reform program. So, for your activity, ang gagawin nyo, you are to identify an agricultural reform problem, no? Na nangyayari dito sa Pilipinas, or you can even base it on your own experience. You have to write about it. Okay? You make a narrative of any issue on agrarian reform in the Philippines. What is this issue? Yun ang number one na sasagutin nyo. What are the concerns? Saan ito? Or ano yung location nito? And then, what are the government measures na ipinapatupad para ma-resolve itong issue na to. So, meron na kayong idea yung sa Hacienda Luisita. And also, we have here issues in Mindanao, no? Agrarian reforms in Mindanao. Or even in the Cordilleras, yung sinasabi natin na issues sa, what do you call this one? Ancestral domains, no? Which includes agricultural lands. So, those are the activities that you will be doing. So, isang narrative ang isusulat nyo doon, my dear students, ang isusulat nyo doon is the issue, where is this issue, what is this issue all about, sino ang involved sa issue na to, and what are the interventions or government interventions to solve this issue. Okay, so thank you for listening. I hope you have learned something about this one. And in the next discussions, we will also discuss other issues which concerns Philippine history. Sabi nga natin, social, political, economic, and cultural because this shapes the present and the future condition of the Philippines. Thank you so much for listening, and I would like to say sorry for some unnecessary noise that you'll be hearing while having this video discussion. Thank you very much.